Sometimes the most desperate prayers are answered by the most unexpected angels. The sterile hallways of St. Mary's Children's Hospital echoed with Elena's footsteps as she made her midnight rounds, checking on the small patients who'd become her entire world since her own dreams of motherhood died with her diagnosis 5 years ago. Room 304 should have been empty. Little Marcus had been given hours to live when his parents said their final goodbyes. Instead, she found the boy sitting up, laughing. His cancer somehow vanished without explanation. The impossibly elegant man standing beside his bed turned ancient, knowing eyes toward her. "Dr. Vasquez," Cassius said, his voice carrying centuries of careful control. "I believe we need to discuss your future." As a woman of science, Elena should have called security. Instead, she found herself listening as this stranger, this creature, laid out an offer that defied every law of nature she'd spent her career defending. When he finished with those 8 words that should have terrified her, Elena surprised them both by asking only one question: "When do we start?" Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The words hung in the sterile air between them, like a challenge thrown down in the face of everything Elena had been taught to believe. Cassius Blackthorne. He'd introduced himself with old-world formality that seemed to bend the fluorescent-lit hospital room around his presence, stood motionless beside Marcus's bed, studying her with eyes that held the weight of centuries. "When do we start?" she'd asked, and now the silence stretched as those ancient eyes searched her face for something she wasn't sure she understood herself. "You're not afraid?" It wasn't a question. His voice carried a faint accent she couldn't place, something that spoke of courts and castles that had crumbled to dust long before she was born. Elena glanced at Marcus, who had fallen back into what looked like natural sleep, his small chest rising and falling with the steady rhythm of perfect health. 6 hours ago, his organs had been shutting down. The experimental treatments she'd fought the hospital board for months to approve had failed. She'd held his mother as the woman sobbed, had signed papers that felt like admissions of defeat. "Fear is a luxury I gave up when I realized medicine has limits," she said quietly, checking Marcus's monitors out of habit. Every reading was normal, better than normal, impossible. "Tell me how you did this." Cassius moved with fluid grace to the window, where October fog pressed against the glass like ghostly fingers. San Francisco's chill had turned brutal this month, and the heating system struggled against the unusual cold that seemed to seep through the very walls. "Life recognizes life, Dr. Vasquez. What I carry in my blood, what my kind has always carried. It remembers what mortal flesh is supposed to be." He turned back to her, and in the dim light, his features seemed carved from marble, beautiful in a way that made her breath catch, dangerous in a way that made her pulse quicken. But that gift comes with a price that grows steeper with each passing year. Elena had spent her career fighting the impossible. Pediatric oncology was a field where miracles were measured in months, where hope lived and died by percentage points. She'd learned to read between the lines of prognoses, to find strength in statistics that would break most people. But this, standing in a room where a dying child had been healed by something that shouldn't exist, this was beyond statistics. "The curse," she said, remembering his earlier explanation. "Your bloodline is dying, not dying, fading." Cassius's fingers traced the window glass, leaving no mark. We were never meant to be eternal without anchor to mortality. For centuries we survived by taking what we needed from the living world. But the old ways are no longer sustainable, and the price of our immortality has begun to compound. My people weaken with each generation. Soon we will simply cease. Elena thought of her own medical records, filed away in Dr. Morrison's office 3 floors up. Premature ovarian failure, secondary to chemotherapy. The cancer that had tried to kill her at 29 had left her alive but hollow, her body beautiful and strong, and utterly unable to create the life she dreamed of since childhood. "And you think a mortal child can save you?" "Not think, no." His certainty was absolute. But it cannot be any child. It must be one born of intention, raised with knowledge of both worlds, a bridge between mortal and immortal, carrying the best of what we each offer. The rational part of her mind, the part trained in evidence-based medicine and peer review, screamed warnings. But that part had been growing quieter over the years, drowned out by the whispered conversations with parents who begged her to try anything at all, by the weight of limitations that felt like betrayals every time she had to say the word terminal. "The supernatural fertility you mentioned," she said, her voice steady despite the way her heart hammered against her ribs. "How does it work?" "My blood carries more than healing. It carries potential. For a mortal woman, a controlled exposure would restore what illness stole, enhance what nature provided." He paused, studying her reaction. "But the process would change you in ways beyond the physical. You would be bound to my world, Dr. Vasquez. There would be no going back to the comfortable limitations of pure mortality." Elena looked again at Marcus, at the healthy flush in his cheeks that had replaced the grey pallor of impending death. She thought of Sarah in room 310, whose leukemia had stopped responding to treatment, of little Jamie, whose brain tumor had grown despite everything Elena had thrown at it. She thought of the empty apartment waiting for her at the end of her shift, of the silence that followed her home every morning, of the nursery she'd never been able to finish decorating because hope had become too painful to sustain. "The children I couldn't save," she said quietly. "Could your blood have healed them too?" "Some of them. Many of them." His honesty was brutal and kind at once. "This is why I chose you, Dr. Vasquez. Not for your medical expertise alone, but for your understanding of what it means to fight impossible odds for the sake of life itself." Elena closed her eyes, feeling the weight of every small patient she'd lost, every family she'd had to comfort while her own heart broke in silence. When she opened them, her decision was already made. "Yes," she said, the word falling between them like a stone dropped into still water. "But I need to understand the terms. All of them." Cassius tilted his head, studying her with something that might have been surprise. "You would enter into this arrangement without knowing the full scope of what it entails." "I would enter into it because Ido know the scope of what I'm living without it." Elena moved to Marcus's bedside, adjusting his blanket with practiced efficiency. "But I'm not naive enough to think this comes without complications. So tell me, what exactly am I agreeing to?" Before he could answer, footsteps echoed in the hallway outside. Elena recognized the heavy, tired gait of Dr. James Morrison, her department chief, making his early morning rounds. She'd worked with him for 6 years, had learned to read his moods in the set of his shoulders and the rhythm of his walk. Today, he sounded defeated. "Dr. Vasquez?" His voice carried through the door. "I need to speak with you about the Patterson case." Elena's stomach dropped. Sarah Patterson, room 310. 8 years old, acute lymphoblastic leukemia, and her last treatment protocol had failed spectacularly. Elena had been dreading this conversation for 3 days. She turned back to where Cassius had been standing, but the space by the window was empty. The only evidence he'd ever been there was Marcus's impossible recovery and the faint scent of something ancient and otherworldly, cedar and smoke, and the metallic tang of power barely contained. "Elena?" Dr. Morrison knocked softly. "Are you in there?" She cast one more glance around the room, then opened the door to face the ordinary world she'd been living in for the past 34 years. James Morrison looked every one of his 58 years this morning. His grey hair was disheveled, his usually immaculate white coat wrinkled from what had probably been another night spent sleeping in his office. The lines around his eyes had deepened since Sarah's latest scans had come back. "How's our miracle boy?" he asked, moving to Marcus's bedside with the careful, reverent steps of a man who'd spent his career watching children die. "Stable. Better than stable." Elena pulled up Marcus's latest labs on the room's computer terminal. "His white count is perfect, liver function normal, no signs of the organ failure we were expecting." James studied the numbers with the expression of a man trying to solve an equation that kept changing variables. The experimental treatment worked better than we projected. Elena nodded, not trusting her voice. The lie felt strange on her tongue. She'd built her career on scientific honesty, on admitting when she didn't know something rather than pretending expertise she didn't possess. But how could she explain that the real cure had come from a creature that shouldn't exist, offering her impossible things in exchange for equally impossible choices? "About Sarah," James said quietly, and the careful neutrality in his voice told Elena everything she needed to know. The latest protocol failed. Completely. Her blast count has tripled since last week. He sank into the chair beside Marcus's bed, suddenly looking older than his years. "I've been on the phone with Children's Hospital of Philadelphia and St. Jude all night. There's an experimental CAR-T therapy trial, but she doesn't qualify. Wrong genetic markers." Elena had already researched every available option, had spent her own sleepless hours making calls and sending emails to colleagues across the country. "What about compassionate use protocols?" "I've submitted the paperwork, but the pharmaceutical companies aren't optimistic about her response profile." James rubbed his eyes with the heels of his hands. "Elena, we need to start talking to the family about comfort care." The words hit her like a physical blow. Comfort care. Palliative measures. The gentle euphemisms that meant they were giving up, that medical science had reached the end of its usefulness and all that remained was to make Sarah's final weeks as peaceful as possible. Elena thought of Sarah's laugh, bright and infectious despite everything she'd endured, of the way she'd insisted on wearing her favorite rainbow socks to every treatment session, of her parents who'd moved from Portland to be closer to the hospital, who'd reorganized their entire lives around the hope that medicine could save their daughter. "I'll talk to them," Elena said. "We'll talk to them. Together." James stood, his movements heavy with the weight of too many similar conversations. 3 o'clock this afternoon. That gives us time to review all the options one more time, make sure we're not missing anything. After he left, Elena stood alone in the quiet room, listening to the steady beep of Marcus's monitors and the distant sounds of the hospital waking up around her. In 4 hours, her shift would end. She'd drive home through the fog-shrouded streets to her empty apartment, eat breakfast alone while the city bustled with life outside her windows, then try to sleep in a bed that felt too large and too cold. She thought of Cassius's words, "You would be bound to my world, Dr. Vasquez." There would be no going back to the comfortable limitations of pure mortality. The comfortable limitations, as if there was anything comfortable about watching children die because medicine simply wasn't enough. Elena was reviewing Marcus's chart when her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number, the children's wing. "Rooftop garden. When your shift ends." "See." She stared at the message until the screen went dark, her reflection ghost-like in the black glass. No one had access to the hospital's rooftop garden except maintenance staff. It had been locked to patients and visitors for years after budget cuts eliminated the funding to maintain it properly. But somehow, she wasn't surprised that locks would prove meaningless to someone like Cassius Blackthorne. The rest of her shift passed in a haze of routine, punctuated by moments of impossible clarity. Every child she examined made her think of Sarah Patterson, whose parents would arrive at 3 o'clock, expecting hope that Elena couldn't provide. Every normal test result felt like a small betrayal of the children whose numbers fell outside acceptable ranges. Every time she passed room 310, she felt the weight of conventional medicine's limitations pressing against her chest like a stone. At 7:47 a.m., she found herself standing in the stairwell that led to the roof, her hand on the emergency exit door. The sign warned that opening it would trigger an alarm, but when she pushed through, only silence followed her into the grey October morning. The rooftop garden was a graveyard of good intentions. Raised planters held the skeletal remains of what had once been a healing space for young patients, withered herbs and flowers that had died when the irrigation system failed, and no one had the budget to fix it. The fog hung low over the city, muffling the sounds of morning traffic and making the world feel suspended between sleeping and waking. Cassius stood at the far edge of the space, looking out over the fog-shrouded streets. In the pale morning light, he seemed less substantial somehow, as if he were part of the mist itself. "You came," he said without turning around. "Did you think I wouldn't? I thought you might require time to convince yourself that what you witnessed was real." He faced her then, and she could see the weight of centuries in his expression. Most mortals prefer the safety of doubt when confronted with impossible things. Elena moved closer, her feet crunching on dead leaves that should have been cleared away months ago. "I have an 8-year-old patient who's going to die because medicine isn't enough. I stopped having the luxury of doubt the day I realized that everything I'd trained for, everything I'd dedicated my life to, has an expiration date built into it." Something shifted in his expression, surprise perhaps, or recognition. The Patterson child, room 310. "How do you—" Elena stopped herself. Of course he knew. If he'd been watching the hospital long enough to choose her, he'd know about all of them. "Yes, Sarah. Her parents think I can save her, and you cannot. Not with the tools your world provides." The words hung between them like an accusation and an offer rolled into one. Elena thought of the conversation waiting for her in 9 hours, of Sarah's parents' faces when they realized hope had run out of time. "But you could," she said. "I could heal her, yes. Her leukemia would become nothing more than an unpleasant memory." Cassius moved closer, and Elena caught that scent again, ancient power wrapped in something that reminded her of thunderstorms. But such interventions cannot continue indefinitely without consequences. "My people have remained hidden for good reason, Dr. Vasquez. Mass healings would draw attention we cannot afford." "Then what are you offering me? The ability to save one child in exchange for giving you one?" The arithmetic felt cruel and precise, like every other medical calculation she'd ever made. "I am offering you the ability to save many children over time, with discretion and care. To push the boundaries of what mortal medicine can achieve." His eyes held hers steadily. "And yes, in exchange, I ask that you use the fertility my blood would grant you to bear a child who can bridge our worlds. But consider, that child would grow up knowing both the limitations and the possibilities. They would have access to healing that could save countless others." Elena walked to the edge of the rooftop, where the fog swirled thick enough to hide the street below. The city felt distant and muffled, as if she were standing at the edge of the world itself. "The conversation I have to have this afternoon," she said quietly. "Telling Sarah's parents that there's nothing left to try. I've had that conversation 17 times since I started working here, and you're tired of having it. I'm tired of being helpless." The admission felt like stepping off a cliff. "I became a doctor to save children, but the tools I have, the knowledge I've spent years acquiring, it's not enough. It's never enough." Cassius joined her at the railing, his presence solid and impossible beside her. "What I offer comes with prices beyond what we've discussed. You would see things others cannot see, know things that might disturb your sleep. The world is stranger and darker than most mortals realize." Elena thought of her empty apartment, of the silence that had become her only companion. She thought of Sarah's rainbow socks and Marcus's impossible recovery. "When?" she asked. The word hung in the air between them like a challenge, and Elena immediately felt the magnitude of what she'd just asked. The fog swirled around them, carrying with it the scent of salt and something else, something that reminded her of old books and darker promises. "Not yet," Cassius said, and she heard caution in his voice that hadn't been there before. "This is not a decision to be made in the shadow of immediate grief, Dr. Vasquez. What I offer will change everything about your existence. There is no returning to the woman you are now." Elena's hands gripped the railing harder than necessary, her knuckles white against the metal. Below them, she could hear the city beginning to stir, early commuters navigating streets made treacherous by the unusual October cold, the distant sound of foghorns from the bay. The ordinary world, continuing its ordinary business, while she stood on a rooftop discussing impossible things with a creature that shouldn't exist. "You think I haven't considered that?" The words came out sharper than she'd intended. "You think I don't understand what I'd be giving up?" "I think you understand loss," he said quietly. But loss and transformation are not the same thing. What you would become, it is not simply Elena Vasquez with supernatural abilities. The woman who accepts my gift will be someone new. For the first time since Marcus's impossible recovery, doubt crept in around the edges of her certainty. Elena had built her identity around her medical training, around her ability to fight death with science and determination. The thought of becoming something else, someone else, made her chest tighten with a fear she couldn't quite name. The medical board would ask questions, she said, grasping for practical concerns to anchor herself, about the improvement in patient outcomes, about treatment methods that aren't documented anywhere. Cassius nodded. You would need to become very careful, very clever. The healings would need to appear gradual, consistent with experimental protocols that could withstand scrutiny. It would require a level of deception that might sit uneasily with your current ethical framework. Elena thought of the Hippocratic Oath, of the promise to do no harm that had guided every decision of her career. But what constituted harm when conventional treatment meant watching children die? Was it more ethical to preserve her moral purity or to accept power that could save lives, even if it came with strings attached? The child you want me to bear, she said, her voice barely audible above the wind. What happens if I'm not a good mother? What if I can't love something that exists because of a bargain rather than because of choice? The question surprised her even as she asked it. She'd wanted children for so long that the desire had become a constant ache, but standing here on the edge of an impossible decision, she realized that wanting and being capable were different things entirely. That concern tells me you would be better at it than most, Cassius said. But I understand your fear. The child would not be a tool, Dr. Vasquez. They would be a person with all the complexity and autonomy that entails. I would not ask you to raise them as anything less than your son or daughter, loved for their own sake rather than for their purpose. But they would still have a purpose, still be expected to bridge worlds, to carry responsibilities they never chose. Elena's voice cracked slightly. I know what it's like to live with expectations that feel impossible to meet. I wouldn't want to do that to a child. The admission hung between them, raw and unexpected. Elena had never spoken aloud about the pressure she'd felt her entire life to justify her survival when the cancer that should have killed her had merely stolen her fertility instead. The guilt of being alive when other patients hadn't made it, the desperate need to make her continued existence meaningful by saving as many children as possible. Everyone lives with unchosen responsibilities, Cassius said. The question is whether they also live with the power to meet them. Our child would not be ordinary, but they would not be helpless either. Our child. The phrase sent something electric through Elena's chest. Not quite hope, but the shadow of what hope might feel like if she let herself believe in it. I need time, she said finally. I need to think about this when I'm not exhausted, when I'm not about to watch another little girl die because medicine isn't enough. Of course. Cassius stepped back from the railing, and immediately Elena felt the space between them like a physical absence. But do not take too long, Dr. Vasquez. Every day that passes is another day children suffer because you possess only mortal tools to help them. The words felt like manipulation and truth in equal measure. Elena watched him move toward the stairwell door, his footsteps silent on the fog-dampened concrete. Wait, she called. When I decide, how do I find you? He paused without turning around. You don't. When you're ready, I'll know. Then he was gone, leaving Elena alone with the fog and the weight of choosing between the woman she'd always been and the mother she might become. Elena stood alone on the rooftop for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, watching the fog shift and swirl through the skeletal remains of the garden. The weight of Cassius's absence felt almost as substantial as his presence had been, leaving her with nothing but the distant sounds of the waking city and the impossible choice he'd laid before her. When she finally made her way back downstairs, the hospital buzzed with a familiar rhythm of day shift taking over from night. Elena moved through the handoff reports mechanically, her mind still caught between the ordinary world of medical charts and the extraordinary offer that hung just beyond her reach. Every child she'd signed off on felt like evidence in an argument she was having with herself. Marcus thriving in defiance of every medical expectation, Sarah Patterson counting down hours until a conversation that would steal the last of her parents' hope. The drive home passed in a blur of fog-dampened streets and brake lights bleeding red through the grey morning. Elena's apartment greeted her with its usual silence, carefully curated books on pediatric oncology, a kitchen designed for one, windows that looked out onto a city that felt increasingly distant from her daily reality. She stood in her doorway for a long moment, seeing the space as if for the first time, the life of a woman who'd organized everything around work, because work was the only place her existence felt necessary. She tried to sleep, but every time she closed her eyes, she saw Sarah Patterson's face. Not as she was now, pale and exhausted from treatments that weren't working, but as she'd been 6 months ago, bright and defiant and absolutely certain that the doctors would fix whatever was wrong with her. The trust in an 8-year-old's eyes had a weight that Elena carried with her everywhere, a responsibility that felt heavier than any medical degree. At noon, she gave up on sleep and called the hospital. Dr. Morrison's office. This is Dr. Vasquez. I need to know, has the Patterson family arrived for their 3 o'clock appointment? They're here now, actually. They wanted to spend some time with Sarah before the meeting. Dr. Morrison is with another patient, but he'll be ready at 3. Elena hung up and stared at her reflection in the black screen of her phone. In 3 hours, she would sit across from 2 people who had restructured their entire lives around saving their daughter, and she would tell them that medical science had reached the end of its usefulness. She would watch hope die in real time, and then she would go home to this empty apartment and pretend that being helpless was the same as being ethical. The decision crystallized with startling clarity. She was back at the hospital by 2:30, moving through corridors that felt different now, not like the familiar territory of her professional life, but like the border between one existence and another. Sarah's room was full of afternoon light filtering through fog, and the little girl looked impossibly small against the white sheets, her parents flanking her bed like sentinels. "Dr. Elena!" Sarah's voice carried a fraction of its old brightness. "Mom said you're coming to talk to us later. Are you going to tell us about the new medicine?" Elena's throat tightened. "We'll talk about everything in a little bit, sweetheart. How are you feeling today?" "Tired. But Dad brought my art supplies." Sarah held up a drawing of what appeared to be a rainbow-colored dragon. "This one's magic. It makes sick kids better just by breathing on them." The words hit Elena like a physical blow. She managed to admire the drawing, to make appropriate conversation with Sarah's parents, but all she could think about was the way Hope looked when it was running out of time. Dr. Morrison found her in the hallway 20 minutes later, his expression already set for delivering unwelcome news. "Elena, I've been reviewing Sarah's latest imaging. The progression is faster than we anticipated. We need to discuss palliative care options with the family. What if there was something else?" The words came out before Elena could stop them. James paused, his hand on Sarah's door. "What do you mean?" Elena looked past him into the room where an 8-year-old girl drew magical creatures while her parents kept vigil beside her bed. She thought of Marcus sleeping peacefully 3 floors up, his impossible recovery defying every medical principle she'd learned. She thought of Cassius's words, "Every day that passes is another day children suffer because you possess only mortal tools to help them." "I mean, what if the tools we have aren't enough?" she said quietly. "What if playing by the rules means letting children die when there might be other options?" James studied her with the careful attention of a colleague who'd watched her work for 3 years. "Elena, you've been on nights too long. This job, watching children suffer, it changes how we see things, makes us desperate for solutions that don't exist. But they did exist." Standing here on the threshold of a conversation that would steal a family's last hope, Elena knew with absolute certainty that other solutions did exist. The only question was whether she had the courage to reach for them. "James," she said, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was about to do, "I think there might be a way to save her." James's expression shifted from professional concern to something sharper, more alert. Elena, what are you talking about? The weight of the moment pressed against Elena's chest like a physical thing. She was standing at the exact point where her old life ended and something unknown began, with Sarah Patterson's life hanging in the balance and James Morrison watching her with the careful attention of someone who'd just heard a colleague suggest something that bordered on malpractice. "There's an experimental protocol," she heard herself saying, the lie forming with startling ease. "Completely off books. I've been in contact with researchers in Europe who've had success with cases like Sarah's." It wasn't entirely untrue, she told herself. There were researchers and there would be success, just not in the way James would understand. "What kind of protocol?" His voice carried the cautious tone he used when discussing treatments that hadn't been peer-reviewed. "Elena, you know we can't offer unproven therapies to families without proper oversight." "I know." Elena glanced toward Sarah's room where she could see the little girl's parents leaning close together, their whispered conversation carrying the desperate urgency of people running out of time. But what if we could get approval for compassionate use? What if there was a chance it could work? James ran a hand through his graying hair, a gesture she'd seen him make countless times when wrestling with impossible decisions. The ethics committee would need documentation, clinical trial data, safety profiles. Even for compassionate use, we'd need something to show them. "Give me 48 hours, Elena said, surprising herself with how confident she sounded. "Let me make some calls, pull together what I can. If there's nothing concrete, we proceed with palliative care. But if there's a chance—" "Elena," James stepped closer, lowering his voice, "I've watched you carry these cases like they're personal failures. That's not sustainable and it's not helping anyone. Sometimes accepting limitations is part of being a good doctor." The words stung because they came from a place of genuine concern. James had been her mentor when she'd first arrived at St. Mary's, had guided her through the particular grief that came with pediatric oncology. He was trying to protect her from the kind of desperate hope that could destroy a physician's judgment. But he didn't know about Marcus. He didn't know about impossible recoveries and ancient powers wrapped in perfectly human faces. He didn't know that limitations were just another word for giving up. 48 hours, she repeated. "That's all I'm asking." James studied her for a long moment, and Elena could see him weighing professional protocols against the trust they'd built over 3 years of working together. Finally, he nodded. 48 hours. But Elena, if this experimental protocol doesn't materialize, if you're chasing shadows because you can't accept that we've reached the end of what medicine can offer, I need you to step back from this case. For your own sake. Understood? He squeezed her shoulder briefly, the gesture of a colleague who'd seen too many good doctors burn out from carrying impossible weight. "I'll talk to the Pattersons. Tell them we're exploring one more option before we discuss next steps." Elena watched him disappear into Sarah's room, heard the careful modulation of his voice as he delivered news that was simultaneously hope and delay. Through the doorway, she could see Sarah's mother reach for her husband's hand, could see the desperate gratitude that flickered across both their faces. She had 48 hours to broker a deal with darkness, to transform herself into something that could bridge the gap between medical science and ancient power. The magnitude of it should have terrified her, but all Elena felt was a strange, fierce clarity. Her phone buzzed with a text from her supervisor, need to discuss scheduling changes. "Can you come in early tonight?" The mundane request felt surreal after the conversation she'd just had. In a few hours, she would return to the familiar rhythms of night shift, checking vitals, adjusting medications, fighting death with tools that felt increasingly inadequate. But everything had changed now. She was no longer Dr. Elena Vasquez, pediatric oncologist bound by the limitations of conventional medicine. She was a woman who had 48 hours to save a little girl's life by accepting powers that would transform her into someone else entirely. As she walked toward the elevator, Elena caught her reflection in the polished metal doors. She looked the same, tired, determined, carrying the weight of too many sleepless hours. But something in her eyes was different now. Something that recognized the woman she'd been was already becoming a memory. The hospital moved around her with its usual efficiency, nurses and doctors and families navigating the complex choreography of healing and hope. None of them knew that in 48 hours everything might change. None of them knew that salvation might come wrapped in shadows and ancient bargains. But Elena knew, and for the first time in months, she felt like she might actually be able to save someone. The elevator descended through the hospital's familiar geography, but Elena felt like she was moving through foreign territory. Every floor marker that flashed past seemed to count down toward a decision that would remake her entirely. By the time she reached the parking garage, her hands were trembling, not from fear, but from the strange electricity of having committed herself to something impossible. The drive through San Francisco's fog-shrouded streets felt like navigating between worlds. Elena found herself cataloging everything with peculiar intensity, the way afternoon light filtered through the marine layer, the sound of traffic bleeding through her car windows, the weight of her hospital badge still clipped to her scrubs. These small, ordinary details felt precious now, like artifacts from a life she was about to leave behind. At home, she stood in her kitchen and tried to make coffee with hands that couldn't quite hold steady. The familiar routine, measuring grounds, adding water, waiting for the machine to hiss and gurgle, felt like performing a ritual from someone else's existence. When her phone rang, she nearly dropped the mug. "Elena, it's James." Dr. Morrison's voice carried a carefully controlled concern. "I wanted to check in after our conversation. Are you sure you're thinking clearly about this experimental protocol?" Elena closed her eyes, seeing Sarah's rainbow dragon drawing, hearing the trust in an 8-year-old voice asking about new medicine. "I'm sure." The Pattersons are grasping at this hope like it's the last solid thing in their world. If this falls through, it won't fall through. The certainty in her own voice surprised them both. James was quiet for a long moment, and Elena could practically hear him weighing her track record against the desperate edge he'd detected in her demeanor. "Elena, in 3 years, I've never seen you make promises you couldn't keep. But I've also never heard you sound quite like this. Are you sure you're not letting emotional investment cloud your judgment?" Emotional investment. The phrase felt laughably inadequate for what was happening to her. She wasn't just emotionally invested anymore. She was preparing to mortgage her humanity for the chance to heal children that conventional medicine had written off. "My judgment is clear," she said. 48 hours, James. That's what we agreed." After he hung up, Elena sat at her kitchen table and tried to organize her thoughts into something resembling a plan. She needed to research everything she could about Cassius Blackthorne, about the kind of power he was offering, about what accepting his bargain would actually mean. But every search she ran turned up nothing useful, just a few scattered references to historical figures who might or might not have been the same person, academic papers about folklore that felt irrelevant to her immediate crisis. The afternoon stretched on with agonizing slowness. Elena attempted to sleep, to eat, to engage in any of the normal activities that usually filled her off hours, but everything felt hollow. She kept thinking about Sarah's parents, about the way hope had flickered back to life in their eyes when James mentioned exploring one more option. They were probably researching experimental treatments right now, Googling terms they barely understood, calling relatives to share the first good news they'd had in months. The weight of their trust felt heavier than any medical responsibility she'd ever carried. As evening approached, Elena found herself standing at her bedroom window, watching fog roll in from the Pacific like some vast grey migration. The city disappeared and reappeared in the shifting mist, familiar landmarks becoming ghostly suggestions of themselves. It felt appropriate somehow. The world was already becoming less solid, less certain. Her phone buzzed with a text from Maria Santos. One of the night shift nurses heard you might have something for the Patterson girl. God, I hope so. Her mom hasn't stopped crying since this morning. Elena stared at the message until the words blurred together. The hospital staff was already talking about Sarah's case, already investing their own hopes in whatever miracle Elena had promised to produce. The ripple effects of her decision were spreading outward, creating expectations she couldn't meet through any conventional means. She typed back, working on it. "How's Marcus tonight?" "Amazing. Like nothing was ever wrong with him. Whatever you did, it's holding. His parents are talking about taking him home tomorrow." Elena's breath caught. Marcus was going home, a healthy child returning to a normal life because she'd accepted help that came wrapped in shadows. The proof of possibility was right there, walking the pediatric ward with strength that defied every medical principle she'd been taught. When she arrived at the hospital 3 hours early for her shift, Elena felt like she was reporting for duty in a war she'd declared, but didn't yet know how to fight. The familiar sounds of the children's ward, monitors beeping, nurses calling to each other, the distant murmur of families keeping vigil, seemed to carry a different weight now. Everything depended on what happened in the next 40 to 8 hours. Everything depended on her willingness to become someone else entirely. For the first time since medical school, Elena wasn't sure she was ready for what came next. The pediatric ward felt different as Elena moved through it, her early arrival drawing curious glances from the evening shift staff. She made her way to Marcus's room first, needing to see the evidence of what she'd already accepted with her own eyes. The boy was sitting up in bed, coloring with an intensity she hadn't seen since before his diagnosis. His parents flanked his chair, their faces transformed by a joy so profound it seemed to radiate from them like heat. When Marcus looked up at her approach, his eyes held the clear brightness of perfect health. "Dr. Elena!" He held up his drawing, a superhero figure with cape flowing behind him. "Look, I made you a picture. He's called Dr. Amazing, and he saves all the sick kids." Elena's throat constricted. "It's beautiful, Marcus." His mother reached for Elena's hand, squeezing it with desperate gratitude. "I don't know how to thank you. Yesterday we were planning a funeral, and now," her voice broke, "now he's asking if he can try out for Little League in the spring." The weight of their gratitude settled on Elena's shoulders, like a physical thing. This was what Cassius's power could do, transform despair into hope with the kind of thoroughness that defied medical explanation. But it also meant that every choice she made now would ripple outward through dozens of families, creating expectations that conventional medicine could never fulfill. She managed to extract herself from Marcus's room and headed toward the nurse's station, her mind churning with the implications of what she'd witnessed. The impossible had already become routine for her, but for everyone else, miracles like Marcus's recovery would demand explanations she couldn't provide. "Elena." Dr. Morrison's voice cut through her spiraling thoughts. He was standing beside the central computer, his expression carefully neutral. "I've been thinking about our conversation, this experimental protocol. I'm going to need something concrete to present to the ethics committee. Documentation, contact information for the European researchers' preliminary data." The lie she'd built that afternoon suddenly felt as fragile as spun glass. Elena had 45 hours left to produce evidence of research that didn't exist, or to confess that her only hope for saving Sarah Patterson lay in accepting an offer from a creature that shouldn't exist. "I'm working on it," she said, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. "The time difference makes communication challenging, but I should have something by tomorrow night." James studied her with the careful attention of someone trying to solve a puzzle. "Elena, I've known you long enough to recognize when you're carrying something difficult. Whatever's going on here." His words were cut off by the sharp sound of an alarm from room 314. Sarah Patterson's room. Elena's blood turned to ice as she and James rushed down the hallway, the familiar choreography of medical crisis taking over. Sarah was seizing, her small body rigid against the hospital bed, while her parents pressed themselves against the wall in terror. Elena's training kicked in with automatic precision, checking airways, administering medication, monitoring vitals. But part of her mind remained fixated on the cruel timing of this emergency. It took 20 minutes to stabilize Sarah, to stop the seizure and bring her back to consciousness. When the little girl's eyes finally opened, they held a confusion that hadn't been there before, a dimness that spoke of increasing neurological involvement. "Mama?" Sarah's voice was smaller now, younger sounding. I don't feel good. Her mother rushed to the bedside, smoothing Sarah's hair with hands that shook visibly. It's okay, baby. The doctors are taking care of you. Elena met James's eyes across the bed and saw her own grim assessment reflected there. The tumor was progressing faster than their most pessimistic projections. They had days, maybe less, before Sarah's condition became irreversible. Dr. Morrison? Sarah's father stepped forward, his voice carefully controlled. The experimental treatment Elena mentioned. How quickly could we access it? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Elena felt the weight of multiple gazes, James's growing suspicion, the desperate hope in the Pattersons' faces, Sarah's trusting confusion. Every person in this room was looking to her for salvation she couldn't provide through any conventional means. We're still working through the logistics, James said carefully. Elena, perhaps we should discuss the timeline privately. But there was no timeline. There was only a choice between watching an 8-year-old die or accepting an offer that would transform her into something her medical training couldn't even name. Elena looked at Sarah's pale face, saw the trust that still flickered in those young eyes despite everything, and felt something crystallize inside her chest. She had spent 3 years fighting death with inadequate tools, watching children suffer while she remained bound by the limitations of conventional medicine. She had organized her entire existence around the hope that science and dedication would be enough, that playing by the rules would somehow balance the cosmic injustice of childhood cancer. But Marcus was going home healthy tomorrow. Marcus was drawing superheroes and asking about Little League because she had chosen to step outside those rules. The ordeal wasn't just beginning. It was demanding everything she'd believed about who she was and what she could accept in the name of healing. Elena followed James into the hallway, her heart hammering against her ribs as Sarah's parents remained at their daughter's bedside, whispering reassurances neither of them believed. The seizure had changed everything, accelerated a timeline that was already impossibly short. Elena James's voice carried the weight of 3 years of mentorship and trust. I need you to be completely honest with me. This experimental protocol, does it actually exist? The question hit her like a physical blow. She opened her mouth to deliver another carefully crafted lie, but the words wouldn't come. James had guided her through her first pediatric loss, had sat with her in this same hallway when she'd broken down after losing 3 children in 1 week. He deserved better than deception. But the truth was impossible. The research is real, she said finally, which wasn't technically a lie. Cassius Blackthorne had been conducting his own form of research for centuries. But the access is complicated. James studied her face with the careful attention of a physician reading symptoms. What he saw there made his expression shift from concern to something approaching alarm. Elena, you're scaring me. In all the time I've known you, you've never been evasive about medical options. If this treatment exists, why can't you provide basic documentation, contact information, anything the ethics committee could review? Before Elena could answer, her phone buzzed with a text message. She glanced down and felt the world tilt sideways. Dr. Vasquez, I'm afraid our arrangement has become impossible. The council has discovered my recent activities and has forbidden any further intervention. I apologize for any inconvenience. CB. Elena stared at the screen until the words blurred. The phone trembled in her hands as the full magnitude of the message crashed over her. Cassius was withdrawing his offer, the power that could save Sarah, that could transform Elena into someone capable of healing the impossible cases. It was gone. Elena? James stepped closer. What is it? She couldn't speak. The carefully constructed hope she'd built over the past 48 hours was collapsing with devastating thoroughness. Without Cassius's intervention, she had nothing to offer the Pattersons except conventional palliative care and empty platitudes about making Sarah comfortable. Elena, you're white as a sheet. What's wrong? The protocol, she whispered. There's been a complication. The researchers have suspended the program pending review. The lie felt like swallowing glass, but it was the only explanation she could offer, that wouldn't require revealing the truth about ancient powers and impossible bargains. James's face hardened. When did you learn this? Just now. I'm as shocked as... No, his voice cut through her explanation with surgical precision. No, Elena, you're not shocked. You're devastated, which suggests you've been more invested in this mysterious protocol than any rational physician should be. What aren't you telling me? Elena felt tears burning behind her eyes, but she couldn't let them fall. Not here. Not when Sarah's parents might emerge from their daughter's room at any moment looking for updates on the miracle cure that no longer existed. I thought I could help her, she said, and this time the truth came through her voice like blood through a bandage. I thought there was a way to save her that conventional medicine couldn't provide. Elena, James's expression shifted to something that might have been pity. Honey, this is what I was trying to warn you about. The desperate need to save every child. The willingness to chase treatments that exist more in hope than reality. It's destroying your judgment. My judgment is fine. Is it? Because from where I'm standing, you just promised a dying child's parents that you had access to experimental treatment that apparently never existed in any meaningful way. The accusation hit her like a slap. Elena knew how it looked, like a physician who'd crossed the line from advocacy into delusion, who'd let her own inability to accept medical limitations cloud her professional ethics. But James didn't know about Marcus walking healthy through the hospital halls. He didn't know about the impossible recoveries that were being reversed even as they spoke, about power that could remake the fundamental rules of mortality. He didn't know that for 48 hours she'd actually had the ability to save Sarah Patterson, and now that salvation was dissolving like mist. I have to tell them, Elena said, the words scraping her throat raw. The Pattersons. I have to go in there and explain that their daughter is going to die, because I promised something I couldn't deliver. We'll tell them together, James said quietly. And afterward, you're taking a leave of absence. Elena, you need help processing this kind of loss, and you need it before you make promises to another family that you can't keep. Elena nodded, though his words felt like they were reaching her from a great distance. Through Sarah's doorway, she could see the little girl's parents holding hands beside the bed, their faces bright with the hope she'd given them just hours ago. In a few minutes, she would walk into that room and watch that hope die.